This next project is based off of the principle of balance and the element of shape. A shape is a visually perceived area created by an enclosed line, color, or change in value. So if you see from these three examples, a shape could be created through outline, through sort of a simple change in value or texture, or also through color. Thinking back to project 2, shapes are a part of all images. So whether representational, so it refers to a work of art that has recognizable subject matter, but so it remains in sort of that representational. It could be anywhere from naturalism, based on literal or closely observed depictions of the natural world, or abstraction, a visual representation that may have little resemblance to the real world, or it could be non-objective or non-representational, meaning that it has no reference to observed reality. Abstraction is something that may have little resemblance to the real world, but it's still based off the real world. Oftentimes, it's a simplification of natural or basic shapes. Sometimes it's reductive, meaning that the subject matter is reduced to its simplest or most basic building blocks. The degree of abstraction can vary from artwork to artwork. So it can be simple, basic, or complex geometric shapes. This is something to really think about with the next project because you'll be starting from abstract shapes. It could become something, but it still may remain very abstract. This is one of the most famous pieces of abstraction by Marcel Duchamp, described as nude descending the staircase. Can you see the figure in this piece? Duchamp has simplified the figure down to its most simplest form, so he's thinking about the figure, but also its movement through time. Non-objective abstraction means that a work of art has no reference or basis in observed reality. So there's no reference or symbolism in it. Oftentimes, non-objective work is critiqued solely on its visual design, so color or composition. Non-objective work can still convey emotion. For example, in this Mark Rothko piece, he often talked about how his works were meant to represent emotion or conflict. Very famously, his last work symbolized his fear and death, where he oftentimes used black to symbolize sort of the void of the unknown. Non-objective work also heavily resides on form, so meaning looking at how those colors and shapes interact. There are different types of shapes. We talked about this during our very first PowerPoint. Geometric shapes are shapes that are based off of straight lines, often man-made. So you see things like squares, circles, rectangles. Biomorphic or organic shapes are shapes that allude to natural or organic forms. So you see they symbolize often things found in nature. So, or in the biology within the human figure, or even in our interiors. So sort of cells or body organs. Positive and negative shapes are something we talked about in our first PowerPoint as well. Positive shapes are the main object or the figure or subject in a matter. Negative shapes are the ground that surrounds the figure. So it's the empty space behind the figure. Oftentimes, we don't think about the negative space being important, but in a successful composition, those positive and negative shapes need to be balanced. Figure versus ground relationships describes how those interact. So when it occurs when both the positive and negative space interact with the other to create a unified whole. So, for example, in this piece we see by Bill Brandt, the negative space and the positive space are equally important. Interaction of the edges in the picture plane also creates an awareness of the visual edge. So if you see the arm in the front of this figure, it's often it becomes almost a background shape where the black becomes the more important shape of the piece. Figure versus ground relationships also add visual texture and excitement to an image. Interesting negative shapes flow and help establish unity, so they help to keep the eye moving all the way around the page. Another type of shape is convex versus concave shapes. Convex and, convex and concave shapes help hold together compositions like a puzzle. So we see one surface up against each other. This is something you're really going to have to think about in this project because your positive shapes will become your negative shapes at a certain point, and how those puzzle pieces come together will be important to a successful composition. Figure versus ground reversal is when the positive shapes at first command our attention and the negative shapes begin to move forward and spatially command our attention. So it requires a balanced dialogue between those opposing forces. If you look at this piece by M.C. Escher on the left, the bird is the positive shape and it's commanding our attention. As we move to the right, the ship becomes the positive shape and commands our attention. In the middle, it's a little more difficult to tell. They start to kind of mix together and are very equally balanced. Planned negative spaces are something that graphic designers often use to make the negative space of their image more interesting and command images in unique ways. Negative shapes are very important to letterform and typography. They're often used in advertising. It's something to think about for your next project. If you want to think about creating an eye-catching design, you're going to have to think about planning some of those negative spaces because when you flip it, those will become the positive spaces, and how they interact will create a dynamic composition. Artists often think about this, and as we talked about in the last project, creating those focal points and areas of interest will be very important. The principle of balance is also an important part of this next project. The principle of balance is one of the principles of design. In the principles of balance, the elements of design are equally distributed to appear equally weighted. These elements should be balanced to make sure that the elements feel stable. Types of element distribution include symmetry, approximate symmetry, radial symmetry, and asymmetry. We talked about some of these during that first PowerPoint, or second PowerPoint as well. Symmetry is formal balance. In a symmetrical composition, the elements used on one side of the design are similar to those on the other, meaning that they are equally balanced. So if I draw that line down the center, both sides are equal. In approximate symmetry, the elements used on one side of the die are very similar to those on the other, but not quite the same. So even though, they're not exact, but they're very similar. So, for example, below, you might have one object in a different color or different size that balances the objects on the other side. Radial symmetry or radial balance means that objects are arranged around a central point and may be very similar. If you remember back to that first palette point, mandalas are examples of this. We're thinking about all the balance radiating out from the center of the composition. In asymmetrical balance, we have an informal balance. The sides are different, but still look balanced. So you might have a heavier, dark object balanced by a more complex object, or on the other side, we have a light area balanced by a similarly shaped yet smaller, darker object. There are lots of ways to balance things asymmetrically. If you remember back to our earlier PowerPoint about the rule of thirds, asymmetrical balance of elements within a design is a way to control where the viewer's eyes will travel and what they will see. You want to create an interesting composition so that the viewer's eye will flow throughout the page. So if we're creating symmetrical balance, you want to create energy and tension. We're thinking about using those rule of third points, right? When we divide the composition into 9 equal parts, you're thinking about putting some of your asymmetrical focal points along those rule of thirds to help balance the composition. So we'll look at a couple examples of that. Here's Helen Frankenthaler's piece. Artists use balance in all kinds of different ways. We're thinking about by, creating something that's just a little bit different or a little bit off, but yet still balanced. We can create an interesting composition. So let's look at some student examples for this project. So remember, earlier we had made organic examples of these and then mixed and matched them. The next part is creating 3 compositions. Now I will say, if you're making these, you can use tape as you're creating your compositions and take pictures of them if you want to reuse similar pieces. For the final piece, these should be glued down, and then you're going to actually flip your original composition to create symmetrical balance so that you will have one side where the positive shapes are in black and one side where the positive shapes are in white. So they should be flipped. In a successful composition, those positive and negative shapes will be equally balanced. So there's a few examples of that. On the left, the white is the negative space, the black is the positive space, and on the right, it's flipped. Now, how you want to put these together is up to you. You could have them short or long ways. You can also think, I've had people do this a variety of ways, where originally they cut the pieces out of black, and then on the other piece they cut the pieces out of white and put it on the black sheet of paper. Or you could also cut the background out so that I cut the white shapes versus the black shapes. It doesn't really matter to me as long as they're equally balanced. You could also think about using tracing paper to help you. So you could trace the black shapes over the white shapes. You could retrace them again on white paper. A couple different ways to do that. The key is that both sides are equally balanced and that they're mirrored in the center so that you're not necessarily replicating it, but you're flipping the piece as it goes to the other side. So, as if you're looking at a mirror image of your original composition.